A lot of marketers are trying to do more local marketing in Asia Pacific. Now, Nishita, you have an example in India. I'd love to hear more about what you guys did.
Yeah, great question there, Joe. So a lot of us marketers, we tend to look at it in terms of global programs, localize or regionalize them for our countries or regions, etc. But what we are looking at, and when one looks at a specific audience groups, especially in the Asia Pacific, we've noticed that programs that are built or conceptualized in the region for the region tend to work better across various metrics, cost, and just getting our brand known with the audience. One specific example is our Disney Hotstar partnership, which indeed has ongoing in India. This has worked well for us. So Indeed is the world's #1 job site. And of course, Disney Hotstar is a very well-known established OTT platform in India across various swaths of the audience, if you will. We partnered with Disney Hotstar to create a bespoke 6-episode series around job seeking. So it spoke about the more amusing or conversational aspects, not the very formal approaches around job seeking. It was called The Interview. We partnered with a few influencers on the ground who the audience of job seekers, if you will, would recognize and even look up to. We had job seekers talk about challenges, opportunities, some funny situations which may come up, which they do, right? Job seeking is not just a very cut and dry formal process. So this was a big hit. We launched this earlier in 2023 around the March or April timeframe. Our team partnered with Disney Hotstar. We went through the content. Everything was brand approved, but we also kept the human and humorous elements in play. So it worked quite well in terms of reaching a large group of the audience at a relatively low cost. So much so that a lot of the idea of this program has now been picked up and we'll be looking at it in various parts of the world. So that is a moment of pride for our team in Asia to have a program and an idea created and conceptualized in Asia being picked up and rolled out globally.
Yeah, I love the example because it goes against what a lot of job seeking content is around, which is resume tips, interview tips. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when everyone's doing the exact same thing, the question is, how do you zig when everyone is zagging or vice versa? So I love that you brought humor into it because you took a situation that tends to be a bit more stressful, but in this situation, maybe a bit lighthearted and maybe a bit educational as well too. Now, I'm curious, you did have some big name partners there. You mentioned Disney and Hotstar. Do you think that you would have had as much of a success if you didn't have those big brand name partners you're working with?
Yeah. So again, I think both parts to that kind of question. One is, it is important when a marketer looks for partners to look for brands of repute, somebody who lives up to even your brand promise, right? End of the day, you're staking your name and your brand promise with another partner. So that is important as well. That doesn't mean that if you go, you need to go only with the big or formal names. We've also had success in various markets with maybe scale ups, startups who are doing something really new, amazing, exciting, etc. So there's always, I would say, pros and cons, but it is important that all partners have a similar ethos and direction they want to move towards. They uphold certain standards. That is important. It doesn't matter the size of the company as much.
I love that because what I'm constantly trying to tell my students is they always think in terms of partners. They always think, oh, the biggest is always the best. So I'm glad you dispelled that myth and said, look, there's a lot of smaller organizations that maybe are not as well known, but are still doing something interesting. And you can still have success working with those kind of partners. I imagine it's also easier logistically, maybe budget-wise, to work with some of those partners as well, too. So I think a lot of key insights there. And another thing you mentioned, going back to the zigging when everyone is zagging, I constantly hear that radio is dead. And I know that you did a recent campaign here in Singapore. So I'd love to hear, what was your experience like on that campaign?
Yeah, we've had some interesting learnings there. In fact, this was a campaign run in July and August 2023. So for a lot of, in multiple parts of the world, when you say radio, you're like, it's dead, it's for a certain genre. different sorts of people, not necessarily, say, the 18 to 35s. But in Singapore, we found it, and we've had a lot of research with some of the big media houses, etc. Radio is actually an effective way to reach out to the audience. So now one way is, sure, you run ads, you create jingles, etc. But another way is to partner with radio stations. And this is where we partnered with Kiss 92. We co-created a show with them, which ran 10 weeks, where both of us, we brought together career influencers, people with tips on, like you said, resume, job tips, etc. And users could actually write to them through SMS and through WhatsApp with, of course, an Indeed branded term, asking their career questions, and not just job seeking, but how do you move up in your career? How do you network? What do you do if there's gossip in the office, etc.? How do you deal with various work situations? And all of us coming off the back of COVID, it is a new world of work, right? Even for us who, like me, have been in the workplace for a long time, but for a lot of people. So just getting back to office, getting back to interacting with colleagues. Maybe a lot of us want to move up in the career ladder or move laterally. So we had the opportunity for people, whether job seekers or not, and we received over, I think, 5,000 folks in Singapore sharing their questions with us. And a lot of these influencers shared their responses via radio. And we took this offline, not offline, but beyond the radio as well, on Instagram, on TikTok, etc. So this was one of our more successful campaigns in Singapore.
I love that example because when we talk about radio, it's usually a one-way communications. And I think this is the challenge that comes in when you're trying to communicate with the audience, interact with them, and also measure as well, too, because radio, it's difficult to assess how well it's doing. But the fact that you had people write in SMS with their questions added that two-way dialogue to it, which made it a bit more interactive. And also you can quantify it a bit. Like you said, you have 5,000 people in Singapore who answer the questions, or who ask questions. And you can imagine there's many more who are probably listening and trying to finding out the answers to those questions. So I love that because, once again, it breaks away from what we can traditionally think of radio as a dead platform. It doesn't work. But the fact that you turn it into two-way communications and you're able to quantify it, I think is quite an interesting approach.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's probably the genesis of it. It doesn't matter which channel, but to get the conversation going, which is what people across generations want. Nobody wants to be spoken to anymore, whether it's a B2B campaign, an ad, whatever. You want to have your opinion out there, to ask questions, to interact with somebody you may have seen on television, etc., but you want to interact with people, just get your views out there. I think that is the crux of probably marketing today versus what it was, say, 20 years ago.
Absolutely. It should be that way. A lot of organizations still move in the traditional one-way route, but I like that you have taken traditional channels and you've made them kind of two-way. You measured them. So I think it's quite clever. Now, I'm curious, as we wrap up the year's end, what has been your biggest key learning? What is, from starting in January to where we are today, what has been the biggest learning for you?
So, see, I think this has been a year of learning for a lot of us, right? And probably even more as 2024, etc. dawns. But I think personally for me, it's the Pareto principle is true in marketing, which is the 80-20 rule. Sure, we do a lot of things. We create the big strategies, the plans for the year, what's the waterfall of where we're getting leads from, and the awareness and PR engagements. But if you look at it towards the end of the year in terms of what happened, it's actually 20% of programs, budget, potentially even 20% of your bandwidth or your team's bandwidth that has driven 80% or definitely a majority of results. But the hard part is identifying which 20%, right? So I think this time of the year, it really does serve us to pause before just running, rushing, making the next year's plans, but to look back, saying what worked, what didn't, why. There is, I think, a lot of tendency to jump to the next great thing or maybe compare ourselves to other markets or competitors. But even just where we were 12 months ago, what have we learned from them? What's really worked? What has changed, etc. I think we all have the scope to be more efficient as marketers. We are the brand custodians, and we also, in some ways, the budget custodians. So that is a tremendous amount of responsibility. So I think being efficient, being very purposeful in what we are doing and why, and standing by it is probably a learning for all of us and probably a skill that all of us need to look at as we get into the next year.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up the 80-20 rule because it's something I'm constantly talking about in class, but I'm glad that it is illustrated in the work you're doing. Now, I'm curious, how do you talked about briefly, how do you identify that 20%? What are some of the methods you go to make sure that you're identifying the right things to go forward for next year?
So what we do sometimes is we initially, when we start planning the next year, we look at actually a smaller budget and say, you've got to drive the same results. What are the programs you really need to have? Push our own thinking, our team's thinking in terms of what if it was 50% of the budget? Would you really do program A? Or would you go to program B? Or is B just a nice to have and not a must have? We start with a lower base, if you will. That's one way. Another is just looking as much as possible. It's not always possible, but at ROI. And it's easier, for example, in B2B. How many accounts did we engage with from an account-based marketing framework? What are the number of meetings, the proposal value, the SQLs, etc.? It's a little more nebulous in B2C. I have to give you that, but it still is possible. When you look at the programs, what was the measure of success? The overall budget divided by just the metrics, etc. So what really moved, what didn't? In a global company, one of the advantages is then you're also comparing against markets. So you've got to be that much better, that much more efficient sometimes than your neighbor in the next country because budget may go to them. So it's competition internally and then, of course, externally that you need to work on. But I would say just being really focused on ROI and we are pushed. Did that event drive X amount of dollars or not? Did that campaign, for example, help us get X amount of visitors or drive unaided consideration up, etc.? Now, some programs are quicker. You can look at ROI. Some in marketing, like awareness, consideration, the gestation period is longer. So you tend to see the results over 6 months, 9 months, a year when you're consistently sending. But that's where it gets tricky. And that's where conversations between marketing and the board are a little bit more unique versus the ones which are, okay, we spent and we saw the ROI in this quarter. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that approach of, once again, taking all the ideas, because at the end of the year, every team is planning what they want to do next year. Obviously, looking at what they did will work well, but having that laundry list of ideas, and to your point, categorizing those into must-haves and nice-to-haves, or nice-to-dos, for example. And then I like the qualifier as well. So let's say we were going to cut our budget by 50%. Which of these would move into the must-have bucket, and which would it be in the nice-to-have bucket, so to speak? So it really helps prioritize teams, because I think a lot of teams really struggle with that, is they create these long lists, but then it's very piecemeal. They don't really know what their focus areas are for the next year or the next quarter. So I love that exercise because I think it's very practical, and I think a lot of teams can definitely apply it.
Yeah, I think that's a lesson we all have to continually learn and practice. As marketers, we believe that more is better, and that's not always the case. In fact, as a manager, I'm sometimes pushing my team saying, let's make it simpler, let's make it more single-minded versus 4 things all equally important. That can't be the case, but always just simpler is still better, because we're still dealing with people at the end of the day, in spite of all your chat GPT, etc. at the site.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. These are principles I'm constantly shouting about in my class. Is simpler is better, less is more. And I'm glad that you've illustrated this. So Nishita, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your insights and your experiences with us. I found it super helpful and practical. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe, and wish you all the best in the new year.
Absolutely. And for everyone watching and listening to today's episode, feel free to share it with any of your colleagues in B2C or B2B. A lot of practical takeaways in there. So thank you guys so much, and we'll see you on the next episode.